The plan was to strike two blows in the general direction of Prague, one from the north by the 1st Ukrainian Front and the other from the southeast by the 2nd Ukrainian Front. The Prague operation anticipated the encirclement of the enemy and the dispersal of all his forces in Czechoslovakia. But of course, the ultimate prize was Prague itself. Stalin strongly intended to seize the capital of Czechoslovakia before the total cessation of hostilities. This operation also included the participation of the 4th Ukrainian Front. It would operate from the east in cooperation with the right wing of the 2nd Ukrainian Front, but was not supposed to be directly involved in the attack on Prague itself. Polish, Romanian, and Czechoslovak forces also participated. Altogether, more than 2 million men and women, 30,450 artillery tubes and mortars, 1,960 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 3,000 airplanes were involved. The Red Army could permit itself such a concentration of combat forces on one axis only in 1945. The 31st Army's role in the Prague operation was secondary. Operating on the far left flank of the 1st Ukrainian Front, its task was to provide flank protection for the northern prong of the attack on Prague, ensuring that any German groupings to the east of the city would not be able to interfere with the advance. On the 7th of May 1945, the 1st Ukrainian Front, the left wing and centre, went on the offensive with 5 combined arms armies, including the 31st Army. That same day, our 331st Rifle Division received the order to advance its regiments into the Sudeten Mountains. Its task was to cover the roads leading to Prague from the east at all costs. Some of the more imaginative officers anticipated dire scenarios, and they commented upon the mission with all seriousness. "Now we're in for it, lads. Hold on. We're going to be like Panfilov's men in front of Moscow. We'll make our stand to the death." For this operation, the 331st Rifle Division organized the advance into multiple mobile battalions. We rolled southward, meeting little organized resistance. In fact, the day before, on the 6th of May, Army Group Centre had initiated a general retreat from Czechoslovakia. The Germans were trying to reach the relative sanctuary of the American lines and largely avoided major contact with our units. Most of the German formations were scurrying out of the pocket we were trying to establish, and the 331st Rifle Division only encountered small, straggling groups. But we continued to advance through the Sudeten Mountains, setting up screening outposts and blocking detachments on the roads leading toward Prague from the east. At this time, much of the fighting was already occurring to our west and in the city of Prague itself. As in the case of Warsaw, in early May, the citizens of Prague launched an uprising against the occupying German forces. They were anticipating the near arrival of either American or Red Army forces, and were trying to save the city from major destruction in the final days of the war. Residents blockaded the city streets, and thousands of civilians took part in the rebellion. The Germans reacted swiftly to the uprising because it threatened to block the route of retreat for their units south and east of the capital city. Schörner ordered, "The uprising in Prague must be crushed." German forces began to move on the city from various directions. From the north, the SS Panzer Division Das Reich, from the east, the SS Panzer Division Viking, and from the south, a regiment of Das Reich that had become separated from its parent formation. The German garrison inside Prague, initially taken by surprise, began to organize a ruthless response to the uprising. Hundreds of citizens were rounded up and executed. Although both American and Red Army forces seemed within easy striking distance of Prague, neither side made any attempt to come to the relief of the uprising. The Americans seemed not to realize the political ramifications if Stalin took Prague, while Stalin appeared to be repeating the policy he had shown in front of Warsaw in 1944, allowing the uprising to be crushed prior to entering the city. Help for the rebellion came from an unexpected source: General Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army, ROA. Realizing that Nazi Germany was now doomed, Vlasov made a desperate calculation to side with the Czech uprising. perhaps hoping that a successful uprising might bring political sanctuary for the ROA soldiers from a new nationalist Czech government before the Red Army reached the city. Major General Sergei Kuzmich Bunyachenko's 1st ROA Division turned against the Germans, routed some German units guarding the airfield, and took control of it, destroying 50 airplanes and 100 tanks in the process. The Czech populace greeted Vlasov's men joyfully as liberators. Events were now moving quickly. On the evening of the 7th of May, German troops in Prague abandoned the city in order to join the general retreat toward American lines, leaving behind all their tanks and heavy weapons. Realizing that the Red Army would now inevitably seize Prague, at 3 a.m. on the 8th of May, General Bunyachenko gave the order for the ROA 1st Division to pull out of the city and join the flight to the west. When units of the Red Army entered Prague on the 9th of May, they immediately began rounding up and executing Vlasov's soldiers who had remained in the city after the departure of Bunyachenko's division. My division took no part in direct fighting for the city of Prague, but all of us, officers and soldiers alike, received the medal for the liberation of Prague from our government. What were we doing at this time? We were still in the Sudeten Mountains, watching the roads leading through them to the west. I was with the command of one of the mobile battalions, and we regularly went around the blocking positions we had set up to check on them. At 8 a.m. on the morning of the 8th of May, 1945, our mobile battalion was moving into the suburbs of the town of Schlewitz in the Sudeten Mountains. It had been ordered to seize the railway station there and then to advance farther. Though at the time we didn't know it, the world was now celebrating. The enemy had been vanquished. We found the streets of Schlewitz full of animated people in their festive national costumes. They were waving little flags in greeting that they had plainly sown the night before, and tossing flowers and souvenirs at our vehicles. Everybody was rushing towards the town centre for a celebratory meeting on the occasion of their long-awaited liberation from the occupiers. The Germans had abandoned the town only that dawn. An elderly Czech woman told us that 3 officers, who had been living in their home, had not had time to gather their overcoats during their hasty departure. A second woman was asking us what she should do with a dog that the Germans had abandoned. Someone needed medical assistance. One fellow was joyfully reporting that he had uncovered a food storehouse on a neighbouring street. I jumped off the truck and checked the time on my watch. I had only 10 minutes. I crossed the street, stopped at the nearest home, and knocked on the door. A young, attractive woman opened it. I asked in German for a glass of cold water. Unexpectedly, smiling pleasantly, she answered me in flawless Russian. "Come on in, Captain. I'm a Russian." I entered and immediately found myself in a luxuriously furnished parlour. Paintings in expensive frames decorated the walls. It seemed I had seen them somewhere before, but I couldn't recall where. The lady of the house brought in a bottle of wine on an elegant tray. "I think," she said coquettishly, "you've earned a bottle of French champagne today." Taking my leave a few minutes later, I thanked her, and then mustered up the courage to ask her, "What's your name? How did you wind up here?" "I'm from the Crimea. My name is Vera, and how I wound up here, I'll probably have to tell you at some other time," she replied. As we took leave from each other, Vera tossed some stunning news at me. London radio has just reported that this evening in Potsdam, German generals will sign an act of unconditional surrender. I gave her some friendly advice to gather up her things as quickly as possible and head home. A few minutes later, our column of vehicles, with a battery of 57mm guns in tow, moved on down the road. That evening, we celebrated Victory Day. All of us frontline soldiers could write complete novels about these happy hours in the lives of millions of people on the planet. 3 days later, things became more peaceful even on our sector of the front. Very quickly, our battalion reached an outpost that we were instructed to reinforce. In general, all of our operations in the Sudeten seemed like children's games. If only one of the 15 divisions the enemy had positioned in Czechoslovakia had fallen upon our position, little would have remained of us. But according to the latest intelligence, the German units had begun their retreat to the west even before our arrival in the Sudeten. The division took up defensive positions and placed so-called combat outposts on the roads leading to Prague. It had no fight with the enemy. Other divisions were still busy with that. After the hard fighting in East Prussia, our division wasn't even up to a game of tag with the enemy. Meeting with one of our forward posts during a routine tour of our positions, we were all shocked by what we found. During the war, none of us had ever seen such a show like the one we encountered there. The soldiers were all drunk. They had formed up into such dancing circles that it seemed the ground was shaking. In a garden in front of a 3-story house, around an enormous bonfire, the flames of which almost seemed to leap to the sky, soldiers, some in their undershirts, some barefoot, not wearing service caps or belts, were doing folk dances and whooping as if they were mad. Crowds of similar wild men were gathered around the dancers, furiously clapping their hands to the music. Gunshots into the air were ringing out. A harmonica was playing in accompaniment with a piano. Brother Slavs had dragged an enormous table out of the premises and onto the lawn and were feasting at it. Emptied bottles of wine were rolling around everywhere. Interspersed among the soldiers, Czech men and women were dancing in their stylish national dress. That, roughly, is the scene that appeared before us. The lieutenant colonel, an assistant to the division's chief of staff, immediately flew into a rage at the sight of this carnival scene, which seemed to him to be totally inappropriate for a military environment. He grabbed the post commander by the shirt and began to shake him. "What's going on here?" the lieutenant colonel began to thunder. "Instead of an alert combat outpost, drunken feasting and revelry. Senior lieutenant, you have big troubles waiting for you. But in the meantime, I am relieving you of duty, and I request that you immediately hand me your gun." Everybody around fell silent immediately. The soldiers and the local citizens were waiting for what would happen next, and this is what happened next. "Scram, you!" the senior lieutenant spat out with surprising disdain. He was literally shouting in the senior officer's face. "The war is finally over. The enemy has been defeated. Victory! But nitwits like you don't know a damn thing, and even if you do know something, you hide it from your subordinates and wait for instructions from above. The Allies accepted the unconditional surrender of the Germans yesterday, the 7th of May, 1945, in Reims, and tonight, before midnight, the Fritzers are going to sign another final capitulation in Berlin." The lieutenant colonel was confused, fell silent, and then mumbled, "Oh Lord, how did I miss such a historic event? Victory?" But then he likely thought to himself, how did this fresh-faced little officer find out about it? Did the Czechs announce it, or did he learn it through the soldiers' telegraph? Without any orders, in a single bound, we officers and soldiers, who had been standing by our vehicles, spontaneously rushed to meet our comrades and exchanged celebratory hugs and kisses with them. How many days and nights had all of us, participants in the war, waited for this day? We took off our caps, unfastened our belts, and joyfully plunged into the common rejoicing. Soldiers grabbed the embarrassed lieutenant colonel and tossed him into the air, then carefully lowered him back to the ground. But now he was shouting at the top of his lungs, "Dance, fellows! You've earned this bright holiday!" Suddenly, I seemed to hear a familiar voice. "Comrade Captain! Comrade Captain!" I turned around and immediately recognized among the soldiers standing in front of me the small group of men who had celebrated my promotion to captain together with me back in Prussia around that campfire. I responded, "Hey, back then it seems there were 5 of you, but now I see only 3. You're right, Captain. The war has been mowing down our brothers to the final day. Vasco, you remember, that dark-haired boy from the Ukraine, has been left behind forever in Prussian soil. Neil wound up in a hospital bed in Königsberg. He got hit in the last battle. Now we were reunited again on that first or second night of victory. I confess my memory has become a bit blurred about these multiple capitulations. Pavel, Ivan, Kondrat, and I. We sat together next to the bonfire. We didn't say anything for a long time, but just gazed into the fire. It seemed to me in these minutes that each of us was making our own reckonings with the war, remembering both the living and the dead. Yet each of us understood that it was precisely him, the common soldier, and no one else who had achieved this miracle. What was I thinking about that night? The reader may find what I'm about to say paradoxical. Despite the bloody ordeals, the human tragedies, and the inconceivable hardships that continued for the 1,418 days of the war, I was thinking that we, its participants, would always remember the war years as the most significant, shining, and honourable episode in our lives. That is indeed what happened. The silence was broken. The first to confess was Kondrat. Back in Prussia, I shared a conviction with my Maruska. Somehow I believed that I would survive this war. The Almighty helped me. Yet how do you think my woman answered me? Don't come back to the village, my dear. You're the only soldier out of 220 homes still alive. The widows will persecute you and me. But I was born in that village and lived there for almost 40 years. Pavel chipped in with his own story. My little brother Yashka returned from the war without either hand back in 43. His Dunka approached him, as if to caress her invalid hero, as if to kiss the stumps of his arms. But instead the woman blurted out into his face, "Damn your nurses for writing me on your behalf for more than a year. I waited for my man, and instead a worthless cucumber has shown up at my door." My little brother didn't give in to that bitch. He started to practice some sort of Hindu yoga exercises to try to be able to do things with his feet instead of his hands, so he could function independently and start a new life. But she, that wicked woman, kept pushing Yashka farther and farther into a corner. Oh, woe unto disabled people in the Soviet Union, both during the war and after it. We invalids have become superfluous, Yashka wrote me in his last letter, before he killed himself. Pavel continued, I had my own score to settle with the fascists. After the liberation of Kiev, I learned that the Germans and their Ukrainian accomplices had executed 13 of my relatives at Baba Yar, including my 3-year-old kid, Vovochka. A week before the start of the war, I received the last letter from my twin brother, Mark. The regiment in which he was serving was positioned just 8 kilometres from the border. On the very first day of the war, the 22nd of June 1941, his regiment was completely annihilated, and Mark went missing in action. But I hid my emotions that day. Unexpectedly, Pavel roused himself and asked me a question. "Do you want us to celebrate, Captain?" "Definitely. The whole world is rejoicing," I replied. "We need to still think it over," Pavel said. "After all, the cost of this war was terribly high, and we've all been damaged by it." "But we're the victors, damn it!" I almost shouted. "You never can tell," my grandma used to say. That's how my first night of victory came to an end. But what was gnawing at the spirits of the soldiers and officers that day and night? We had fought with the enemy with a clear purpose, not sparing our lives, so as to save our motherland. And we had saved her. Now, how would our motherland greet us? That was the chief question on all our minds. But the trumpeters and drummers were already raising quite unseemly praise, from the very first day of victory, to the pockmarked devil, Stalin, as if he was the one who had gained the great victory and not the Russian soldier. Everything was jumbled together back then in people's minds, both great joy and great sorrow, exultation and sadness, and even fear. Reversing our march, our mobile battalion again stopped in the suburb of Schlewitz. We were to pick up a truck that had been left at the railway station. While the battalion rested, I walked over to the familiar house. A young man opened the door. I asked him about Vera. The new proprietor shrugged his shoulders. The authorities had given him, a commander of a partisan detachment, this house as a token of gratitude for saving the town from destruction. He courteously invited me in to have a drink in honour of the victory. We drank a toast in that same parlour, with the same paintings on the wall in their expensive frames. Had anything changed? Suddenly I caught sight of 2 portraits on one wall, the president of the country, Eduard Baynes, and the Communist Party leader, Clement Gottwald. The partisan, noticing my gaze, categorically declared, "There will come a day when we communists will remove one of those portraits." At the time I didn't catch the significance of his words, although I gave a thought to how quickly events were occurring. Just 3 years later, the Czechs really did remove the portrait of Beans, after the Czech communists and their leader Gottwald had seized power in the country with the help of the Soviet Union. It was 8 a.m., the 11th of May, 1945. Peace had arrived. The battalion had been placed in the reserve and was awaiting an order. Our powerful Studebaker trucks were safely hidden away in factory garages. The command had taken up a luxurious villa in which the owner of 3 textile factories had once lived. An enormous, magnificent park with a handsome hotel surrounded the villa. A gardener told us that the owner was a German who had run off with his wife, children, and servants 2 weeks earlier. During the war, the hotel had served as a hospital. Now, our infantry and artillery filled the park. At 6 a.m. that morning, the German Army Group Centre had formally capitulated. Thousands of prisoners, officers and soldiers were now moving along the highway through Schlewitz. The railway station was a prisoner collection point. The villa where we were staying was on a hill, and I had an excellent view of what was happening down on the highway. Toward lunchtime, the situation was changing. Civilians began appearing on the road, first in ones and twos, then in small groups, which soon turned into a throng of people. An uninterrupted living current of refugees filled the highway. Carts crawled along with entire families aboard. Some were pulling along little carts loaded with their belongings, while a few others were trying to pick their way on bicycles through the dense mass of people. The majority of refugees were on foot. People were plodding along, barely shuffling their feet. Many of them were wearing wooden shoes. The sound of these shoes tapping on the pavement grew, turning into a rumble. The people were poorly dressed. Former camp prisoners were among them, growing in number on the road, still wearing their prison garb. On many of them there was still a distinguishing symbol that let the Nazis know how they should treat their slaves. No one had evidently bothered yet to tear off the symbol. By evening, the picture on the highway was changing once again. Armed Czechs in civilian clothing, with white bandages on their sleeves, were setting up roadblocks on the highway close to the city. They were stopping all people leaving the city and taking everything away from them. It looked just like a scene from Russia back in 1917. The next day, representatives of the local authority arrived at the villa and invited us to a meal. A sumptuous table had been set right in the middle of the town square. We drank, embraced, and swore to eternal friendship. After the fête, they invited us to an evening performance by a troupe of French cabaret singers who had gotten stuck in the town. We wanted to go, but alas, we were expecting orders. Returning to the battalion, I noticed another new appearance on the highway. Smersh officers, all carrying brand new submachine guns, had seemingly descended en masse from the heavens. They had set up a swinging gate on the highway, taking the unceasing human traffic under control. As we later learned, several regiments of these men had been flown in on airplanes directly from Russia. They set up controlled checkpoints, KPP, on all the roads in the Soviet zone. As I observed, they were first of all interested in any of the returnees wearing an Ost, East symbol. Out of formality, they checked the people's documents. Where had they been? They checked to make sure none of them was carrying a gun, but they didn't confiscate anything from them. They were politely inviting the Ost returnees to continue their journey aboard trucks, which were standing on the side of the road. A few officers, my comrades and I, descended the hill and approached the KPP. "Where are you taking these people?" one of our guys asked a senior Smersh officer. "We aren't hiding anything from anyone," he calmly replied. "The Americans and British have set up camps for displaced people in their zones. We're doing the same thing. We want to help Soviet citizens who were driven into captivity return home to their motherland." That was true, as far as it went. But it wasn't the full truth, as I will narrate later. Very soon it became known that in just a few weeks after the end of the war, Soviet troops established more than 100 so-called filtration camps in the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany. Thousands of men and women who had been driven by the Nazis from the occupied cities and villages into forced labor in Germany were brought together in these camps. An underlying task was in operation, which wasn't mentioned at the time, but its idea became clear later, to prevent the massed flight of former Soviet citizens to the West. Were you appointed to your position by the former regime? I am a social democrat. I lingered in a concentration camp for 4 years. I have just returned to my native town. The previous Bürgermeister ran off. At the request of the pastor, the people gathered and elected me as their new Bürgermeister. I have a question for you, by the way, which is troubling many citizens. Your generals, when they took German soldiers into captivity, promised to release them immediately after the war's end. Can people have hope that this will soon happen? The war ended 20 days ago, Willie. We still don't know anything about when they will free your officers and soldiers. At the end of the discussion, this is what Willie told me about Lower Silesia. Gauleiter Karl Hanke, the Nazi fanatic, ruled here with an iron hand. Goebbels considered him to be the best Gauleiter in Germany. He was the organizer of the fortress city of Breslau, where so many Germans and Russians died. When Hitler replaced Himmler, he appointed Hanke in his place. This scoundrel tried to escape from Silesia. According to rumors, Czech partisans caught him and executed him. Whether this is true or not, I don't know. Tell me, Willie, do you have a family? My son was killed in the desert. He was serving in Rommel's Afrika Korps. When they arrested me, my wife moved to Dresden to her cousins. She died during the horrible, unexpected bombing of the city. I am now living at my sister Clara's home. Willie, I have 2 requests. As soon as possible, reopen all the private establishments that the people need, and invite your citizens at 12 o'clock tomorrow to a meeting with Russian soldiers and officers. Unfortunately, not a single resident of this town came to the meeting. After my meeting with Willie, I spent a long time strolling around the town, taking in its clever architecture and its mass of greenery, which covered the entire area. I was surprised by many of the street names. Some of them carried the names of German composers, others the names of German commanders. Suddenly, a marvel, Ivan Turgenev Street. I wondered what link this famous Russian author had with Lower Silesia. Near the city centre on Friedrichstrasse, I noticed a signboard, photography, on the first floor of a 3-story building. I decided to drop in to give it a try. At my ringing, a middle-aged, tall, thin German opened the door. For several moments the German looked me over with uncommon curiosity, likely trying to figure out what need I had of him. I introduced myself and asked if I could enter. We sat down at a round table, apparently in a parlour, and began to talk. Soon a woman appeared and set down 2 cups and a miniature samovar in front of us. "Allow me to introduce you," the photographer said, turning to me. "This is the woman of the house, my wife Emma." As we sipped our tea, the photographer and I conversed. "Tell me," I asked, "have you been living in Friedeberg long?" "We arrived here from East Prussia even before the war. I inherited this house from my deceased older brother. Indeed, we had been intending for a long time to get away from the cold, eternally raw and damp climes of East Prussia. Emma has asthma, and her doctor told her to find a dry climate. Silesia is a paradise for her. Clean mountain air. The largest forest preserve in Europe is located here. Did you know that in Friedeberg, greenery covers more than 80% of the area? Where else in the world can you find such a city garden? There are many curative springs in Lower Silesia. Eva Braun came here often for treatment. I hope her name is familiar to you. Russian czars, diplomats and writers have also travelled here. Did you ever serve in the Wehrmacht? No, I'm not a party member, and I'm long past 50. But more importantly, I had polio when I was a child, which left me lame. My right leg is more than 4 centimetres shorter than my left. I had to use crutches whenever I walked because of the imbalance between my legs. Now I get around with a cane. Herr Friedrich, I have a proposal for you. Can you help our soldiers and officers? Many of them will soon be returning home without a single wartime photograph of themselves. We will compensate you. I'll do as you ask, Captain, free of charge, but we have one serious problem. What sort of problem? Do you have any camera film? But where do you usually get yours? In Breslau, but now this is impossible. I'll try. in memory of my son Kurt's name. He was killed in action at Leningrad. There will come a time when I will travel to Russia and find my son's grave. Excuse me, I didn't know of your loss, so we're in agreement. I'll report to my commander. Let's start with you, Friedrich jokingly said to me. That's how these photographs came about. I have preserved them to this day. As we were preparing to say our farewells, a tall, shapely young woman entered the parlour. She had a dark complexion and an unusually expressive face for a German, with large, widely spaced grey eyes. "This is my daughter, Lotta," Friedrich announced as he introduced me to the young woman. I sprang from my chair. I could feel my heart start to pound. Somewhere, I don't know where, the angels began to trumpet. I interpreted their unexpected call as a good omen from the heavens. Lotta asked permission from her father to make a trip to the milk bottling plant. Perhaps they'd give her a little milk. I accompanied her out onto the street, where I asked her permission to escort her to her destination. I received an unexpected reply. "Tell me, Captain, if there, back in Russia, a German officer was seen escorting a young Russian woman, what would the people have said about her? Take a look at the windows in the surrounding buildings, and you'll notice that we're being watched. Of course, if you order me or compel me, I'll comply, but I'm certain you won't do this." "You're right," I answered with disappointment. "Well, we'll meet again, but I would like for you to let your father know that in the future I'll try to arrange it so that they'll deliver milk directly to your home. I sense that milk is very necessary to you, since you, a single German woman, openly went out into the street today and are fearlessly walking alone to the bottling plant. You understand correctly. Emma, my mother, needs the milk. She is a very sick woman. Won't you drop by our place tomorrow at 6 o'clock in the evening? It is Emma's birthday." "Thank you. However, I can hardly come tomorrow, but I'll soon take you up on your invitation." I was 22 years old. Lotta was 19. I paid a visit to the Gunzer family 5 days later. Their residence was located in some woods on the edge of town. Lotta and I began to see each other. Lotta showed me around the most beautiful sections of the town, and we liked to climb the high and steep hills surrounding the town, from the top of which opened distant vistas over the fields, valleys, and rivers. Once we travelled to the Sudeten. We visited a cemetery where her father's older brother, his family, and Emma's grandfather and grandmother were buried. I never again saw anywhere such a clean, well-tended cemetery, where the gravestones were inundated with blossoms and the foliage of the trees, which inclined over the gravesites. Lotta also showed me another of Silesia's interesting sights, its oldest legendary oak tree, which had a massive trunk 10 metres wide. People liked to say that King Frederick the Great had planted it himself. Many popular legends and tales had grown up around the tree. It was genuinely difficult to tear myself away from the sight of this magnificent tree, but Lotta pulled me away and we began to talk. "What were you doing before the war?" I asked Lotta. I was a student. Like all young German men and women, I was a member of the Hitler Youth, carrying out my labour obligation. I worked in a textile factory. I'm curious, what do they call your version of our Hitler Youth in Russia? Lotta suddenly asked me. I didn't decline to answer. I tried to give her a summary account of Russia's Komsomol. I explained to her the goals and tasks of our youth organization. She gasped when I told her that more than 100 million young men and women had passed through its ranks since the moment of its founding by Lenin in 1918. "Did you too?" "Yes, even I." "Are you a communist?" "Yes, I joined the party during the war." "Then who's your god?" "I'm an atheist. Membership in the party is incompatible with religious faith. But I very much believe in fate. There are many times when I should have been killed. During the war, I had my own Captain Nemo. You've evidently read Jules Verne. In the most critical situations, Captain Nemo appeared and deflected the touch of death away from me. I could see how attentively Lotta was listening to me. What I was saying was new and extraordinary for her, as she had only limited access to any information on Russia. It was entitled The Wehrmacht, 1941-1944, and organized by the Institute of Social History. The exhibition created something of a sensation. Viewers saw that the generals, officers, and soldiers of the Wehrmacht were the same sort of ruthless bandits as the SS. All of Germany was shocked. In the first days after the division's arrival in Friedeberg, the remaining population seemed to vanish. The streets were largely empty. The Germans recognized only 3 routes: to the town commandant for rations, to the church for prayers, and to the cemetery to visit the graves of their ancestors. In Silesia, the Red Army caused just as much trouble as it had in East Prussia. Tensions in the city eventually declined, but not immediately. I have photographs from Friedeberg in the summer of 1945 in which people are visible on the streets. But the time for this didn't come quickly. One Sunday, Willie invited me to the 50th birthday celebration for his sister. I arrived with 2 other officers, my comrades. I saw Clara for the first time. She was a tall, lean woman with large, wide eyes, and some sort of fantastic turban of hair on her head. This woman had an authoritative air about her, if only by the expression on her face. She spoke loudly, probably due to her many years of experience as a teacher. Willie once told me about his sister. When I returned to my native city from the concentration camp, Clara was the only person unafraid to greet me. Thanks to Clara, the evening was a real success. The guests all congratulated her and wished her every happiness. Willie procured a keg of beer from somewhere, which we quickly emptied. The time had come for the Germans' favourite form of amusement, a game called Candy Wrapper. According to the rules of the game, those who lost a round had to carry out some suggestion of the proprietress. For example, sing a familiar song, give a little dance, kiss a woman, crow like a rooster, and so forth. All of this, understandably, was accompanied by laughter and was supposed to be in the spirit of good fun. One of my comrades, a captain, lost, and Clara's pronouncement was such that I wanted to spit in her face. She announced that she wanted the captain to drop to the floor, crawl under the table, and shout, "I'm a Jew!" The captain, naturally, refused to carry out Clara's command. To demonstrate our protest against Clara's insulting request, we all stalked out of the birthday woman's house. "There's a real fascist viper for you," the captain said, expressing the general opinion as we left the house. The next day, I ran into Willie and asked him what he thought of his sister's disgusting conduct. Clara, like many other Germans, as you will see, still lives in the past. A lot of time must pass before Germans rid themselves of their Nazi influences. Incidentally, many Germans were infected with anti-Semitism even before Hitler's rise to power. Therefore, they showed indifference to the National Socialist Party's program to deprive Jews of their German citizenship. "Not all Germans are like Clara," I replied. A few days later, a real scandal occurred in the division. The men continued to talk about it for a long time afterward. General Berestov summoned the chief of the Medical Sanitation Battalion and gave him instructions. In special situations, the Medical Sanitation Battalion was to render medical assistance to the residents of Friedeberg and treat invalids with needed medicines. Having heard the general out, Lieutenant Colonel Svirsky leaped out of his chair and nearly shouted at the general, "You can discharge me, punish me, send me in front of a tribunal, but I refuse to carry out your command." "Why?" "Germans are all rats. At Landsberg they wiped out the Medsanbat, shot all the wounded, and murdered my wife. You know all of this. I can't even look at them, Comrade General." Pavel Fedorovitch grimaced. The general was not fond of such scenes of insubordination, but restrained himself and responded calmly, "You're a reasonable fellow, Lieutenant Colonel Svirsky. War is one thing. Now it is peacetime, and that is a different matter. How can we not help the sick, the invalids, and the aged? It is Zhukov's directive that I have passed on to you, and we are obliged to carry it out. I see no difference between the German and the fascist. To me, they are all killers." The chief of the Medical Sanitation Battalion dug in his heels. "Some did the killing while others supported them. Isn't that so?" As everybody in the division knew, the general never altered his decisions once he had taken them. "Get out of here, Svirsky. Go think about these instructions, and once you see the wisdom in them, get busy with them." Among the other officers, naturally, this incident provoked arguments. Some supported Swirsky, others the general. But soon a small receiving room for the local population opened in the Medical Sanitation Battalion. After my failures with the movies and Clara's shocking performance, understanding my wounded feelings, Willie once told me, "Don't think that all of us Germans are like those civilized beasts that tortured and murdered your women and children, like the film Raduga accurately depicted." Here's what he told me next. In Silesia, not far from Friedeberg, lived one of the ancestors of the famous commander Helmut Moltke, James von Moltke, his nephew. On the inherited farmstead where Moltke lived, in 1942, 1943, secret meetings of Germans took place. They were discussing the future of Germany after its downfall, which they all believed would happen. They called their group the Circle. The Gestapo arrested the entire group, and in 1945 they were all executed. On some evenings I still managed to visit the Gunzes and meet with Lotta. One evening, pointing at the piano that decorated the sitting room, I asked Lotta, "Who plays the piano?" "Emma and I. Emma gave me music lessons when I was a child. At the age of 10, I gave public concerts. Life without music is unthinkable to me. As soon as everything settles down, I dream of entering a music conservatory. Do you believe such a time will ever come?" "I do." "And what do you think of music? Who is your favourite composer?" I was silent. My life was such that I had grown without much connection to classical music. Generally, I liked songs from popular films. I finally threw out the first name that came to mind, Tchaikovsky. I tried to hide my ignorance of the music that Emma and Lotta performed, but Lotta seemed to sense my predicament and refrained from further questions on the subject that evening. The next time I visited the Gunzes, Frau Emma and Lotta sat down to the piano and began to play a four-hand version of Tchaikovsky's famous 1812 overture. It was the first time I'd heard this piece, and the performance was a generous gift, made for me by two sweet women. Lotta and I often talked about music. More accurately, she would talk about music, and I would listen to her. Lotta proudly declared that Germany had given mankind the gift of 5 great composers: Beethoven, Haydn, Richard Wagner, Bach, and Mendelssohn. She honestly added that Mendelssohn was never performed during Hitler's reign. Back in her earlier school years, Lotta had visited the home where Beethoven was born, had lived and worked. It was now a museum. Lotta had also travelled to Bayreuth, where there were annual musical festivals dedicated to Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner, Lotta said, was Hitler's favourite composer. He thought of Wagner as his own spiritual leader. The Führer knew the libretto of many of Wagner's operas by heart. Everything started with him, he often liked to say. "Do you consider it proper that Mendelssohn was never performed under Hitler?" I asked Lotta. Of course not, and I wasn't alone in my thinking, but it wasn't considered proper for me to express my opinion. The general, taking in the contents of the paper at a glance, almost snarled, "What a swine!" Then he immediately ripped the paper into tiny pieces, adding, "Don't be angry, Major. Just pretend that you've made no report about anything, and the radio receiver will be turned into the depot this very day." I reported to the division commander at his first summons, and spotting Ribtsov sitting next to him, I turned pale. One could expect nothing good from this man. The clever general dispelled the tension. "You're lucky, Captain, that our division has such an excellent chief of SMERSH. This very day, that radio set will be turned over to the depot." "Yes, sir," I answered. "Consider it done." But what about Shilevich? He had conveniently forgotten about his part in the agreement, and now he was sitting next to the general, holding his tongue. "You can bet I didn't say a thing about him." That very day, I turned Hillard's Telefunken radio receiver over to the depot, having first obtained it from Hillard. The master only shook his head in sadness and felt sorry for me. I never learned what was in the commandant's report about me, but it couldn't have been anything good. Fortunately, they didn't take my motorcycle away from me. I rode around on my beast of a motorcycle for about 3 weeks. I could reach any battalion on it in just a few minutes. I drove the bike like the wind, and it was responsive to my touch. Sometimes I liked to speed across the Oder River and zip down to the Czech border, which was no more than 60 kilometres, 36 miles away. The Czechs would treat me to a mug of beer and a few kind words, and then I'd already be speeding back to Friedeberg. One day I had an accident. On one of the sharp turns in the road, apparently, I lost control of my iron monster for several seconds. The bike headed toward a light fence in a field, beyond which lay a steep, rocky precipice with a boulder-strewn brook far below. I barely managed to turn off the motor and went into a skid. I fell heavily, and the motorcycle flipped over and over, becoming a tangled mass of metal on the highway. I blacked out. I awoke in unfamiliar surroundings, in some German home, lying on a bed. Subjugated Germany. Guten Tag, Lower Silesia. 2 elderly Germans were sitting beside me, sighing and lamenting, offering prayers to God. How did they, the poor things, manage to drag me from the highway to their home? I thanked them endlessly. I asked them to bring me a mirror. I took a glance in it, and my heart sank. My face was lightly scraped all over, my eyes were black, and my trousers and military blouse were torn in many places. My arms were badly bruised and bleeding. I asked the old man to run to the medical sanitation battalion to send an ambulance for me. I do recall one curious detail. As soon as I regained consciousness, I immediately reached for the right pocket of my tunic, where I usually kept my party card. And of course, I checked whether or not I still had my pistol. An ambulance arrived for me. The medical orderlies, laying me on a stretcher, stuffed me into the ambulance, dragged my wrecked motorcycle to the ambulance, threw it in after me, and took us both back to the medical sanitation battalion. 3 days later, I returned to the political department. Colonel Shilovich, giving me a proper scolding, ordered me immediately to present myself to the division commander. Berestov received me out of turn, and as he always did, spoke tersely. "Well, hero, your riding around has gotten you into trouble. Turn over your motorcycle to the divisional depot this very day. You need to have a long life. You still have a lot of work ahead of you." There was one more piece of news, a most unpleasant one. Lower Silesia was to be turned over to Poland. This was one of the repartitions of Europe after the war, as I later found out, thought up by Stalin, and the Allies gave his suggestion their blessing. After Stalin's death, in the Russian state archives in Moscow, historians found a geographical map of Europe dated to the summer of 1944. Back then, the tip of Stalin's red pencil had drawn a circle around Lower Silesia, which indicated it could remain part of Germany. Later, the father of nations changed his mind. He gave Lower Silesia to Poland as compensation for taking away 2 of its best cities, Lvov and Vilnius. I was still not fully recovered from my motorcycle accident. My left arm and right leg ached. One day I was sitting in my room reading the Divisional Gazette, which was still coming out. They had sent one of this gazette's best journalists, Seaman Rakovschik, to Podolsk, where the Central Military Archive of the USSR Ministry of Defense was located. They sent him on an official 3-month mission to gather materials on the history of the 331st Rifle Division. It became known that other divisions had sent their own journalists to the same place. I never saw Seaman Rakovschik again, just as I never saw a history of my own division. The soldier on duty dropped by and announced that they were calling me from the nearby controlled checkpoint. Some young German lady was there, muttering in her own language and seemingly asking for me. "It's Lotta! She wouldn't have come without a real reason," I immediately decided. "Has something happened?" I put on my service cap and, limping, hobbled to the checkpoint, where I found her waiting. It was impossible to recognize Lotta. She was pale, like a very sick person, and trembling with fear. She announced that an hour ago her father had been arrested. Friedrich was at the commandant's office. What news? I asked Lotta to go back home and comfort Frau Emma. "I'll try to find out what's going on," I promised her upon our parting. A meeting with the commandant never promised anything good. We all tried to avoid him as much as possible, but I immediately confronted him. "What? Have you gone crazy? You've arrested a photographer. He's made 120 portraits of officers and soldiers for us. Gunzer was never a member of the National Socialist Party and never took up arms against us. What's the deal? Fill me in. Otherwise, I'll call General Berestov." "Go ahead and call, Captain. This swinish German failed to turn in his camera." I burst out bitterly laughing. "If he turns in his camera, he won't be able to photograph our heroes. The General has authorized him to turn over his camera a month from now," I explained to the senior lieutenant. The commandant began to fidget in his chair. "It's a bad thing, Captain, that you stand up for them. I'll have to write you up. You're a suspicious character." "Go ahead, Senior Lieutenant, write me up." The commandant may have written me up, I don't know, but nothing came of this incident, and Friedrich was released. Perhaps the commandant feared the wrath of General Berestov if he questioned the general's arrangement with the photographer. After the incident with the motorcycle, the chief of the political department gave me 2 days' leave. I sought Willie's advice. How would it be best to spend these 2 days? Willie arranged a Tsar's holiday for me. With the permission of Frau Emma, Lotta and I went to the nearest spa. While the war was going on, the Germans had continued to travel to spas. And what spas they were! They placed us in a miniature coach painted red. A toy steam engine pulled the coach along. An hour later, I found myself in an enchanted world, likely from the tale of 1001 Arabian Nights. Low wooded hills encircled the entire space of the resort. An unusual vale lay between them, covered by a velvet blanket of grass, strewn with flowers. The blue waters of a lake glittered nearby. The masts of handsome yachts were rocking on the waves. Lotta and I descended one of the hills in a cable car and made our way along a narrow path to an enchanted home. There was more glass in it than wood. A plump, ruddy German immediately came out to meet us. He introduced himself. "I'm the proprietor's assistant. I take care of his property. Herr Dietrich hopes, as always happens after a war, that everything will settle down eventually so he can return." "Indeed it must happen, but there are still so many narrow-minded and evil people," I chuckled. Several minutes later, Lotta and I were jumping for joy like children. We would have 2 full days alone together. Here, for the first time, Lotta confessed her love for me. She wanted to spend the rest of her life with her captain. She told me, "I'm ready to go back to Russia with you." There is one curious book in our home library. It says that during the Russian Army's 1813 campaign beyond its borders, many Russian officers were quartered in Saxony and Silesia. They liked to organize evening dances and fell in love with young German ladies. Our women willingly married them, and the officers took them back to Russia with them. The Germans understood that many difficulties awaited them. They weren't accustomed to difficulties, but that didn't intimidate them. They were even ready to live in the Russian countryside. Like everyone else, I was saddened by the news. I sensed the loss of something very important in my life. But to speak honestly, my present division had never become as close and dear to me as the 220th Rifle Division had been. I had found no comrades in the 331st Rifle Division, except for Igor Panin, the editor of the division's newspaper, and possibly the general. He had always treated me warmly, even solicitously, from my very first day with the division. After the meeting, I dropped by to see Igor and asked him to step outside to have a smoke, which meant, "We need to talk." We went outside together, and I immediately began to pester him. "I have a girlfriend here, a German. Give me some advice about what I should do. I've decided to go to Hungary and take her along with me, but our relationship will be apparent there." "What? Are you nuts? I've always thought you were a sensible fellow. You know, they'll immediately sell you out. Then they'll send you to Kolyma, a notorious site in the Soviet Gulag, just like they're supposed to do. It will be the ruin not only of you, but also of your beloved woman." I decided to press the matter, paying no attention to Igor's critical remarks. "I've already asked the chief of the Medical Sanitation Battalion to hire Lotta as a nurse, a dishwasher, or as a lab assistant. Whatever he wants, one can always think of something. But you know what Colonel Sversky told me in reply? You've what, gone mad? Your woman doesn't know a single word of Russian. She'll immediately fail in whatever task she's given. I suggested that he just put Lotta to sleep for the trip to Vienna, and told him that when we get there, I'd take responsibility for her. His only response was, "Well, aren't you the joker? But you'd better stop and think about what you're proposing to do." The swine! How much have Colonel Sversky and I endured together in this war? Together we suffered the tragedy of the Medsenbad at Landsberg, and together we buried Tamer Sversky. Who helped him rebuild the medical sanitation battalion from scratch? Igor cut in. All right, calm down. Don't get carried away with your fantasy. Explain the situation frankly to your girl. If she loves you, she'll understand. Finally, just roll the dice. Give her your Moscow address and telephone number. Perhaps she'll wait for you. Agree with her to meet again after 5 years, no sooner. No one can help you now in such a hopeless situation. I fell asleep and woke up with the thought of our fate. I had wild dreams that night. For example, Lotta and I were tearing along in a carriage to Paris. The musketeers of the guard met us, and D'Artagnan presented us to the king. The next night I had a completely silly dream. Willie had given me a refugee's certificate. Changing out of my uniform into civilian clothes, I became a naturalized Fritz. Together with all the other refugees, I was heading for Germany. We passed 5 controlled checkpoints without any problems. Only about 20 kilometers remained to the German border. But wouldn't you know it, a final checkpoint before the border. By some law of the jungle, a reptilian SMERSH officer was there, intently checking everyone's papers. And then suddenly, fixing his gaze upon me, he declared, "Until you tell me who you really are, I'm not going to let the column pass." At that point, oh, horror, the anti-Semite Clara crawled out of the column, and adjusting the pile of hair on her head, she shouted, "That one's a Soviet officer, a Jew!" The SMERSH officer seized me by the scruff of the neck and flung me down onto the asphalt. I woke up and suddenly recalled that I had decided to go to Hungary. There were altogether 6 of us officers who had made this decision. They had assigned us to a certain artillery brigade. It was presently located about 19 kilometers from Friedeberg, but had become stuck there, as was happening with many other army units that were on the move. The brigade was only going to continue on to Hungary after the 15th of August. Lotta and I would still have a whole month together, and surely we'd think up something in that time. The other officers and I reported to the artillery brigade and moved into a splendid German home. We led a carefree life there without any superior officers hovering over us. Naturally, the only thing that connected us with the artillery brigade was the officers' mess. Several times we journeyed down to Bratislava, and several times we visited a women's processing camp. We were trying to figure out what it was. This wasn't life, but a fairy tale. Such was the gift we received in the initial peaceful days after the war. Early one morning I hopped on a bicycle, having grabbed dry rations for 2 days, and pedalled with all my might. 3 hours later, I was entering the Guntz's home. I was going to spend 2 days with Lotta. I didn't dare be away for longer than that. That evening, when I lay down to sleep in the room that had been offered to me, Lotta entered the room, bringing pyjamas, a large pitcher of hot water, a towel, and a deep basin. She had me lower my feet into the basin and then washed my feet. At first I protested, but nothing came of that. Lotta stayed with me throughout the night. The 2 days flew by. I rode off back to the brigade, but then the next day, back to the Guntz's. On one of my visits, I suddenly noticed, as Lotta tossed the Russian-German dictionary I had given her under the bed, that she wasn't studying the language at all. After the 16th of July, 1945, I watched as a gigantic operation unfolded in Silesia, one with which I agreed at the time. By order of Stalin, Silesia was to be stripped bare before the Poles arrived to take it over. The Captured Items Administration from Moscow oversaw the entire operation. Its representatives didn't have to search for where the hidden treasures were buried. Moscow had already known for a long time and had precisely determined what was to be taken from the Germans and sent back to Russia. Later, I learned that even before the war had ended, the Soviet Council of People's Commissars had already issued decree after decree on the removal of industrial enterprises, rare books, works of art, and the best scientists from the Soviet zone of Germany for shipment back to the Soviet Union. I have collected more than 100 such edicts in my personal archives, starting from the 4th of May, 1945. In each of them, the objects for seizing and dismantling were precisely indicated, including in Silesia. For example, the dismantling of a specific German Krupp's ammunition plant that produced artillery shells and fuses was specified in one of the decrees. The author Gavril Popov discusses this reparations operation in detail in his book Wojna I Prawda, Cena Pobedy, War and Truth, The Price of Victory, New York, Liberty Publishing House, 2005. I will try to describe only that which I saw myself, how they removed everything that they could from Friedeberg. The textile factory was completely dismantled. All the fabric storehouses were emptied, which meant thousands of meters of cloth were taken. Our division got the spoils. Each officer received up to 50 meters of fabric, while they distributed 20 meters to every soldier. Only the walls and roof of the milk bottling plant remained. 5 mechanical workshops and automobile garages were loaded onto Studebaker trucks and delivered to the rail cars waiting at the station. From the local farms, they took cows, which were also sent back to Russia. Most curiously, workers demolished the spa resort where Lotta and I had spent the 2 best days of our youth. All the buildings, the swans, the steel cables, the rails, the cross ties, the pretty little coach cars, the miniature steam engines, the cable cars, and the kitchen equipment were loaded onto rail cars. Who benefited from all this in the future? "That's the German soldiers for you," the labourers and soldiers were all swearing. "The war is going on while they drive around to spas. That only got them into trouble." Trucks rushed along the streets one after the other. They were carrying turbo generators, rusty pipes and boilers that had gone to scrap, along with sand, tiling, bricks and lumber. On one of these days, I accidentally overheard the conversation of 2 German women who were standing next to me on the sidewalk. "Let them take it all away! Let them, as soon as possible! We will build new factories and mills, more modern ones!" From my reading of Gavril Popov's book, I learned that in 1945 alone, 74,000 train cars travelled from Germany to Russia, and altogether prior to the formation of the German Democratic Republic, 400,000 train cars. The Soviets took away everything they could lay their hands on and sent it all back to Russia. On the 14th of August, I rode my bike into the town of Friedeberg as usual, but at first I went to the commandant's office. The night before, I had received a letter from Willie. It was from his hospital. He had recovered from his illness and was now recuperating in a hospital for officers. The letter stated that Willie wanted to meet with me. He wrote that he would be in Friedeberg until the end of August. 42. Mass. Afterward. Reflections on the fighting for Rzhev 4. 133 graves in Rzhev's soil contain the remains of servicemen and women from more than 140 rifle divisions, 50 separate rifle brigades, and 50 tank brigades. The tragedy of this battle lies not only in the unparalleled sacrifices, but also in the lack of success. Despite heavy losses and unimaginable human suffering, no compensatory reward of combat success followed, which generated bitterness and despair among the survivors. Any analysis of the enormous casualties and lack of success experienced by the Red Army around Rzhev must begin with the adversary we faced. The Germans at Rzhev had superior equipment, experienced officers, more effective command and control, extensive combat experience, and professional soldiers. Colonel General Walter Model, a talented and seasoned commander, led the German Ninth Army. After the winter retreats from Moscow, the Germans had spent months fortifying their positions in the Rzhev salient, which they defended with determination. Their fierce resistance led our frontline soldiers to wonder what was driving the Germans to fight so courageously and stubbornly. The Red Army, by contrast, had only numbers on its side. Throughout the 15 months of fighting for the Rzhev-Vyazema bridgehead, we held significant numerical superiority in men and equipment. At designated breakthrough sectors, this superiority sometimes grew to 6 or 8 times the strength of the German defenders. According to data from Belov and T. Mikhailovaya, the superiority of the 30th Army over its opponents in the summer of 1942 was 10-20 times in manpower and 20-30 times in armour. In August 1942, Kalinin Front Commander Is Konev deployed D.D. Lelyushenko's 30th Army to repeatedly assault the German defences around Rzhev, trying to exploit the Red Army's quantitative advantage. Disregarding the enormous losses, the 30th Army Command continued to send fresh battalions into what became a slaughter. Subordinate commanders and soldiers began to recognize the senselessness of the battle, and a sense of apathy and indifference took hold. Meanwhile, intense fighting was ongoing north of Rzhev and further south near Vyazma, where Western Front Commander G.K. Zhukov launched costly frontal assaults. By autumn of 1942, our forces had inched to within 6 kilometers of Rzhev, advancing slowly at great cost. In November 1942, Konev and Zhukov would repeat these bloody assaults on the Rzhev salient during Operation Mars. Yet it took another 6 months of intense fighting before the Red Army finally managed to overcome these 6 kilometers, forcing the Germans to abandon Rzhev. Historian Dmitry Volkogonov cites a revealing conversation between Stalin and A.I. Antonov about the failed 1942 offensives against Rzhev. "Comrade Antonov," Stalin asked, "have you ever stopped to think about why so many of our offensive operations in 1942 were not completed? How do you explain these failures?" Antonov replied, "We operated in a stereotypical fashion without inventiveness. We hadn't yet learned to break through a defensive line simultaneously on several sectors, and we made poor use of tank units." Stalin interrupted, concluding, "The main thing is that we learned how to defend, but not to attack. In short, we still don't know how to fight well." The historian V.V. Bashanov notes that in later years, Soviet marshals echoed Stalin's explanation, justifying their failures as part of a learning process. However, the assertion that the Red Army was still learning how to fight in 1942 is partly true. Stalin's purges had decimated the Red Army's high command, and many commanders and officers had been lost early in the war. Consequently, by 1942, those chosen to lead often lacked the necessary experience. In 1942, the Red Army was still a clumsy instrument. Lacking modern communication means, trained commanders and experienced soldiers, it struggled in the Rzhev meat grinder, despite its numerical superiority. Stalin's statement to Antonov was essentially correct, but he evaded his own complicity. Even when front commanders suggested temporarily halting the costly assaults, Stalin ignored them. Under the iron discipline and fear Stalin imposed, commanders continued to sacrifice countless troops in the Rzhev operations. Official Soviet history has often distorted the events at Rzhev. For example, on August 26, 1942, Moscow radio announced that our forces broke the enemy's line of defense and liberated 610 villages and towns. This was misleading, concealing previous operations and their failures. When the Germans finally abandoned Rzhev on March 2, 1943, Soviet announcements claimed the Red Army seized it. In reality, the German withdrawal was orderly, and Soviet forces encountered only minor resistance. Not one division of the Red Army that fought in the Rzhev-Vyazma bridgehead received the honorary title of Rzhev, likely to avoid drawing attention to the costly campaign. David M. Glantz's book Zhukov's Greatest Defeat explores Operation Mars, but other operations to take the city remain largely unexplored. To convey the full horror of what I saw and experienced at Rzhev, I was drawn to the Moscow frontline poet Nikolai Mayarov's collection, Blizko k Sertsu, Close to the Heart. His heartfelt lines seemed fitting. We knew all the regulations by heart. What's death to us? We are above even death. We have been laid out in ranks in our graves, and we are waiting for a new order. More than 60 years have passed since the events discussed in this book. In November 2007, for my 85th birthday, a talented American woman, Marcia Simansky, wrote a poem for me. I leave you with her words, the old soldier. The old soldier is cooking. Borscht. Smells of the old country. Envelope the oversized tin can. That is his summer home, here in the Berkshires. There's a sparkle in his eyes. His laugh, large and inviting, laces his broken English. Eat, eat, maybe cappuccino? He asks, blending east and west, like the melting pot of his adopted land. He's a Zen master now, words his daily practice. He pushes paper mounds from the pressed board table, his sacred space, lined sheets with cryptic letters, words that hold the secrets of his heart, long ago stories only ready to be told.